Hi there, I'm AK from the Mixpanel team, and today I'm going to talk to you about Data Warehouse Mixpanel, a little module and utility I wrote to stream queries from your data warehouse to events, profiles, groups, or lookup tables in Mixpanel. Effectively, what we have here is an out-of-the-box reverse ETL, which takes a SQL query that runs inside of your data warehouse on bigQuery, AWS Athena, or Snowflake, and streams the results of that query to data in Mixpanel. It's pretty simple to use. All we need to do is run npx Data Warehouse Mixpanel and provide a path to a configuration file that contains the parameters for our job. A configuration file is effectively JSON that contains the name of a data warehouse, how to authenticate with that data warehouse, a SQL query to model the data, a set of mappings for the different column headers in your data warehouse and how those will map to fields in Mixpanel, some Mixpanel authentication details, and some options and tags. You don't have to build this configuration file by hand. There's a neat little tutorial which will walk you through building your configuration file. And you can run that tutorial by running npx Data Warehouse Mixpanel with no arguments. We'll see an example of that in a minute. Today I'm going to walk through a reverse ETL from bigQuery into Mixpanel, but it's worth noting that multiple warehouses are supported. So let's start in bigQuery to just get familiar with the data set that we're going to be streaming to Mixpanel as events. This is a fairly typical setup where we have three tables: payments, products, and users, and they each have different fields. The payments table has things like user ID, time, payment type, and total value. The users table has information like user ID, name, email, plan, age, and the products table has information like unit ID, product name, when that product was released, and so on. On the right-hand side, I have a SQL query which models a join on these three tables. We're taking certain fields from the payments table, certain fields from the users table, and certain fields from the products table. And they're joined together using user ID for the users and payments table and product ID and unit ID for the products table. Not surprisingly, when I run this query in bigQuery, we get a summary table with information on the user, the time, the event or transaction, the payment type and revenue, but also information from the users table, like their email and their name and their plan, as well as information from the products table, like its release month, its product budget, or the intended audience. Now, this SQL query is our model. It contains all the information that we'd like to see in Mixpanel as events. And here I have an empty Mixpanel project, which we are going to pipe this data to. So now we have everything we need to get started. A SQL query, which models a data set that we're interested in using Mixpanel to visualize, an empty Mixpanel project that will be a container for us to send data to, and our trusty module that's going to make this straightforward and easy. So let's start by building our configuration file using the wizard that's provided. So I'll pop open my terminal. This module is written in JavaScript using Node.js. So you'll need Node.js installed on your computer in order to use this, or whatever environment you're running it in. If you don't have Node.js, you can just Google Node.js download and get that activated. So we're going to run npx Data Warehouse Mixpanel with no arguments to start the wizard. npx Data Warehouse Mixpanel. If it's your first time running this, it may ask you to install the package, so just tap yes. And here we are in the wizard. This tutorial is going to ask us a few questions and help us build a configuration file. Once we're finished, we can run it with the following command. For our data warehouse, I'll choose bigQuery. We're going to need our Google Cloud Platform project ID, which I can find in Google Cloud right there. So I'll copy that onto my clipboard and paste it into the wizard. Which region is my bigQuery instance in? This one happens to be in the United States, and you can find that in your bigQuery settings. We're going to need to provide some way to authenticate our requests with bigQuery to stream the data. There are a number of different strategies for authentication with different data warehouses. In the documentation, you'll find a whole section on the sort of warehouse details and the required permissions for each of the different warehouses. In this particular example, I'm going to set up a service account in GCP that allows this module to call out to bigQuery to stream results into Mixpanel. But there are different authentication strategies, including things like application default credentials. This video is not an in-depth overview on IAM with GCP or the other data warehouses, but I'll go through the steps just so you can follow along. I'm going to head over to the IAM console in GCP, and I'm going to search for service accounts. And there's a whole section on creating service accounts. I'm going to create a new service account, and I'm going to give this service account a name, which is going to be data warehouse to Mixpanel demo. And that will start to build an email address and email ID for this service account. And this is going to be a demo for DWH video. So I'll create this service account and I will hit done. So now we see this service account is in the GCP console. I'm going to copy the email address or client email that was presented to this service account. I'm also going to create keys, JSON keys, that are going to be used to authenticate this particular script with GCP. So I'll create a new key. JSON format is fine. And that has been saved to my computer. So in downloads, I now have a file which contains private keys to authenticate as this service account in GCP. The neat thing about service accounts is even though I'm showing a private key on the screen, we'll be able to delete this access at any point later, so it doesn't really risk compromising our data or having a private key floating out there. We'll leave this file where it is. We might need it later. And then the last thing I'm going to do here is in the GCP IAM and admin, I'm going to grant access to this service account that we just created there. I'm going to give it permissions to run bigQuery jobs, which is a required permission for this script. You can find all the required permissions in the documentation, and depending on the setup of your data set, whether it's an external bigQuery data set or a native one, you might need to play around with different permissions to get things in good order. The last thing I'm going to do here is to make sure that service account also has permissions to access this particular data set in bigQuery. So I'll add them as a principal and give them the bigQuery data viewer role. That may seem like a lot of permissions, but that's just the way GCP works. Anyway, we can return to our tutorial in which we're being asked for our service account's email address, which is in that JSON that we downloaded. It's called client email. So I will copy this onto my clipboard and hit OK. And it's asking for my service account's private key, which is also in that JSON. This is a very big value, so I'm going to just copy it onto my clipboard and paste it into the terminal. And it's going to look really long, but that's fine. And now I'm being asked what SQL query that we're going to run on our bigQuery instance. That is the very same SQL query that we saw here, where we're joining the payments, users, and products table together, except I'm not going to include a limit because I want to send all of the data. So I'm going to copy this query onto my clipboard. And I'm actually going to minify this SQL query onto a single line, just so that the command line is happy with the input. So I just use a little SQL minifier to get this all on one line. Very good. Now it's time for the Mixpanel setup. What type of data are we sending? We're sending events. What is our Mixpanel project ID? In this case, our Mixpanel project ID is in the URL, but you can also find it in project settings under project ID. So in this case, it's 2913977. What region is the project in? In this case, it's United States. We're not using European data residency. And how do you wish to authenticate with Mixpanel? In this particular case, I'm going to use service accounts on the Mixpanel side as well. And generating service accounts are very, very easy in Mixpanel. There's a setting under the project settings where you can add a service account and give it a name like Mixpanel bigQuery or something like that. We'll need an administrative or higher role, And I will set this service account to expire in 2 days because I won't need it after this run. Now I'm given my username and secret, which we'll need to send to the CLI. So I'll copy this value onto my clipboard and paste it in here. With my service account secret, I'll copy this value and paste it in here. And now comes the part in which we will map the columns in our BigQuery data set to required fields in Mixpanel. It's worth mentioning that if we take a look at our query results here, there's lots and lots of different columns in our data set. We do not need to map every column explicitly in this configuration file. We only need to map the required fields, and then all the other fields will be used as event or user properties depending on the data that you're importing. So I'm going to have my terminal up here and kind of resize this so we can see the columns. And then I'm kind of going to follow the directions, right? So from BigQuery, which column header should be used for the event name in Mixpanel? And in our case, that's pretty clearly event, which just so happens to be the default, but I'll type in event here. Which column header should be used for event time? And that, once again, is time in our BigQuery query. So I'll use time. Which column header should be used for unique user ID or the distinct ID in Mixpanel? This is a very important mapping because this is how Mixpanel ingests or determines what a unique user is. In our particular data set, the unique user identifier is called the user_ID. So I'll insert that here. And finally, it's asking which column header should be used for insert ID, which is how Mixpanel does deduplication. In my data set, that is just insert ID. You can think of that as kind of like the primary key in most SQL join tables or something like that. Very good. So now just a couple of options. Do we want to use strict mode, which gives us validation on the events? I'll choose yes. Do you want to compress the data or gzip in transit? I'll choose no. Concurrency is a thing that I won't get into in this video, but this is going to determine how many concurrent workers we have, like batching and queuing these events. The default is 20 is fine. And yes, I want to generate logs. It's going to ask if you want to do a test run, and a test run will basically just add a limit 1000 to your query so it doesn't stream the entire data set. I don't need to do that here, so I'm going to select no. And now it's kind of going to give us, I'll make this a little bigger here so we can see it, a summary. So the plan is to load events from BigQuery to Mixpanel, which are modeled by this join SQL query with the following column mappings, where event in our BigQuery table is event name, time is time, user ID is distinct ID, and insert ID is insert ID. And at this point, it's kind of like a, does that look right? Do you want to proceed? If you choose yes, it'll go off and run the import. I'm actually going to choose no. I'll do it later because I want to show what a fully filled out configuration file looks like. So I'll summon this folder, and you can see we now have this BigQuery mixpanel.json file, which contains all of the information that the script needs to run, including the authentication details for BigQuery, the SQL statement, the mappings, along with the options and authentication details for Mixpanel. In this way, configuration files can be reused over and over again if you wanted to set up any sort of automation with this pipeline. Now that we understand the parameters in the configuration file, let's run our job and see our data in Mixpanel. To use an existing configuration file, the one we just made, we can just run npx data warehouse mixpanel and give it a path to our configuration file. So let's do that here. npx data warehouse mixpanel, and this is going to be that BigQuery mixpanel JSON file that we just made. So I'll hit run and we'll watch the thing go. Okay, great. Our job is finished. Streaming has ended, and we successfully processed 1 million events in about 3 minutes, almost 4 minutes. And our throughput was about 5,000 events per second. Let's check out our data. We can head right into our Mixpanel project and head over to the events report. And if I look for events in the last couple of days, we see something kind of amazing. We have events. that are properly put together in user profiles with all sorts of attributes here that was from our source data. Notice how everything that was in our SQL query, like project budget or product ID or product release month, is also in our event data in Mixpanel. So all of these columns automatically get mapped using the column headers as key names. That's great because it means we can start analysis right away in Mixpanel and do things like look at the number of cards that were charged, broken out by payment type, and get that fast segmentation that we just love in Mixpanel. The last thing I'll say here is that all of our event properties and our event names have underscores in them and aren't really named in a pretty fashion. And that's perfectly fine because our data warehouse does not support spaces in column headers. But we can change that to kind of clean up the data for a non-technical user to analyze by heading over to Lexicon and looking at our events or our event properties and start to rename the display labels so that Mixpanel shows something that is maybe prettier or easier to navigate for a non-technical user. So we can change payment underscore type to card type, or project budget to team budget, or something like that. And you can do that for event attributes as well as event names. And after we've done that, now we have that nice, easy to read card type, which is tracked as payment type, but it's perfectly fine for us to update the schema or at least the display labels just in the Mixpanel UI. That's pretty much it. I hope you've enjoyed this short video on creating your own reverse ETL using the Data Warehouse Mixpanel module. And if you'd like to see support for other warehouses, or you have any challenges or problems using this module, go ahead and file an issue or a feature request on the GitHub repository. I'm very open to feedback and I'll be watching that. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you later.